Lucas Warren stood in the marble entryway of the Riverside Grand Hotel, wedding invitation trembling slightly in his hand. After 6 years of silence, Emily had reached out. Her mother called it closure, a civilized ending between two people who'd once meant everything to each other. He'd believed them. He wore his best suit, carried genuine well-wishes, and walked through those gilded doors with an open heart. Then he saw his seat assignment, table 17, next to the bathroom. And he understood. They hadn't invited him to celebrate. They'd invited him to humiliate. The only question now was whether he'd sit down and take it, or burn their perfect day to the ground. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday afternoon. Lucas had been helping his daughter Mia with her math homework when the cream-colored envelope slid through the mail slot. He recognized Emily's handwriting immediately, that careful cursive she'd practiced in college until it looked like something from another century. His hands had gone still over Mia's workbook. Mia looked up at him with those dark eyes that were entirely his own. She was 9 now, born a year after the divorce was finalized. Emily had never met her, never asked to. That was part of the agreement they'd made when lawyers finally stopped talking, and both of them just wanted it over. Lucas opened the envelope alone that night after Mia went to bed. The invitation itself was elegant, expensive. Emily Harper and Jonathan Whitmore requested the honor of his presence at their wedding ceremony. The Riverside Grand Hotel. Black tie optional. He'd stared at it for a long time, trying to decode what it meant that she'd sent it at all. The phone call came 2 days later. Emily's mother, Patricia Harper, spoke in that polished voice she'd always used with him, the one that made every word sound like it was being delivered from a great height. She told him Emily wanted closure, that after all these years, it seemed petty to pretend he didn't exist, that mature people could acknowledge their past without letting it poison their future. Lucas had listened and found himself agreeing. It sounded reasonable, civilized even. He'd been 23 when he married Emily, fresh out of state college with a business degree and ideas about starting his own consulting firm. She'd been 22, beautiful in that effortless way that came from good genes and better money. They'd met at a coffee shop near campus, where she was slumming it between classes at the private university across town. He'd thought their differences made them interesting. She'd thought they made him interesting. There was a distinction there he hadn't understood until much later. The marriage lasted 2 years, long enough to sign a lease on an apartment he couldn't quite afford, long enough for Emily's family to make it clear he'd never be quite good enough, long enough for him to realize Emily agreed with them, even when she said she didn't. The divorce had been Emily's idea, delivered over breakfast on a Sunday morning like she was discussing weekend plans. She'd been kind about it, which somehow made it worse. She said they wanted different things. She said she needed to be honest with herself. She never said what Lucas suspected was the real truth, which was that her family had finally worn her down, and she'd decided being a Harper was more important than being a Warren. He'd signed the papers without fighting, moved back in with his parents for 6 months while he got his feet under him. Started the consulting firm anyway, working 16-hour days until it stopped feeling like spite and started feeling like purpose. Met Sarah 2 years later at a friend's barbecue. She was a teacher, practical and warm, and she didn't care that he drove a 10-year-old sedan or that his apartment was above a dry cleaner. They'd dated for a year before she got pregnant. They'd talked about marriage, but never quite gotten there before the cancer showed up in her lungs, fast and brutal and completely unfair. Maya was 4 when Sarah died. Lucas had been a single father ever since, learning how to braid hair from YouTube videos and becoming an expert on every animated movie produced in the last 5 years. He didn't date, didn't have time, didn't have interest, didn't see the point. His life was full enough with Mia and work and the small, steady routine they'd built together. Emily belonged to a different life entirely. He barely thought about her anymore, except sometimes When he signed his name and saw Warren written out in his own hand, he'd kept it out of inertia more than anything else. It was his name. It had been his father's name. Changing it back after the divorce had seemed like admitting defeat. So when Patricia Harper called and made it sound like attending the wedding was the mature thing to do, Lucas had let himself believe it. He'd even felt something like gratitude that Emily wanted to tie up that loose end. He'd bought a new suit, charcoal gray with a subtle pinstripe. He'd asked his mother to watch Mia for the evening. He'd driven the 40 minutes to the Riverside Grand Hotel with classic rock playing low on the radio and his invitation on the passenger seat. The hotel was the kind of place that made you aware of how much money you didn't have. Vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, marble floors polished to a mirror shine. A string quartet played in the lobby. Women in evening gowns glided past like exotic birds. Lucas tugged at his tie and reminded himself he'd been invited. He belonged here as much as anyone. He found the seating chart near the entrance to the ballroom, a massive board covered in calligraphy, table assignments arranged in neat columns. He scanned for his name, expecting to find himself somewhere in the middle distance, anonymous and appropriate. Table 12, maybe. Table 15. Somewhere he could sit quietly and leave after the cake was cut. Table 17, next to his name in that perfect script. He looked at the floor plan. Table 17 was tucked in the far corner of the ballroom, separated from the other tables by a wide aisle, next to the hallway that led to the bathrooms, the single worst spot in the entire room. Lucas stood very still. Around him, guests flowed past in clusters of laughter and expensive cologne. No one looked at him. No one acknowledged him. He thought about Patricia Harper's voice on the phone, so smooth and reasonable. Closure, she'd said. Maturity. He felt something cold settle in his chest. A woman in a hotel uniform approached him with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She asked if she could help him find his table. Lucas told her he'd found it just fine. She glanced at the seating chart, saw where he was assigned, and something flickered across her face. Pity, maybe. Or embarrassment. She walked away quickly. He could leave. Should leave. Walk back out through that marble lobby and drive home and tell his mother the wedding had been fine, uneventful, forgettable. Mia would ask if he'd had cake, and he could say yes, even though it would be a lie. She was 9. She'd believe him. But he didn't leave. Instead, he walked into the ballroom with his head up and his hands steady. The room was enormous, decorated in white and gold, like a fairy tale. Round tables clustered around a central dance floor. A raised platform at the front held the wedding party table, draped in silk and surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage. Everything gleamed. Everything was perfect. Table 17 sat exactly where the floor plan indicated. Small, round, tucked into the corner like an afterthought. 2 other seats besides his own, both empty. Lucas pulled out a chair and sat down. The bathroom hallway was less than 10 feet away. He could smell the faint chemical sweetness of air freshener. Every time someone walked past, they glanced at him with that same flicker of recognition and discomfort. A waiter came by with champagne. Lucas took a glass he didn't plan to drink. He set it on the table and watched condensation form on the crystal. Around him, the ballroom filled with guests. Beautiful people in beautiful clothes, laughing and embracing and taking their seats at tables that weren't next to the bathroom. He recognized a few faces from years ago. Emily's college friends, her cousin David. None of them looked his way. The seat assignments at his table remained empty. No one else was coming. They'd given him a table for 3 and left the other 2 seats vacant, as if even fictional guests didn't want to sit with him. Lucas understood then with perfect clarity. This wasn't about closure. This wasn't about maturity. This was about making sure he knew exactly where he stood. This was about reminding him that he'd never belonged in Emily's world, and leaving it had been the only sensible thing he'd ever done. The lights dimmed, music swelled. Everyone turned toward the entrance where Emily would appear any moment in whatever dress cost more than his car. Lucas sat in his corner next to the bathroom and made a choice. He would stay. He would sit through this wedding with his dignity intact. He would show them that their cruelty couldn't touch him. And when it was over, he would leave and never think about Emily Harper again. The doors opened. The bride appeared. And Lucas discovered that some humiliations were only just beginning. Emily looked exactly as Lucas remembered, and nothing like her at all. The dress was spectacular, all lace and silk that caught the light as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Her hair was swept up in some complicated arrangement that probably required a professional, but it was her face that struck him. She looked older, which made sense after 6 years. She also looked harder somehow, like something soft had been filed away and replaced with polish. She didn't look at table 17. She didn't look at him at all. The ceremony was brief and traditional. The officiant spoke about love and commitment in the kind of generic language that could apply to anyone. Emily and Jonathan exchanged vows they'd clearly written themselves, full of inside jokes the guests laughed at, and promises that sounded sincere enough. Lucas watched from his corner and felt nothing. No jealousy, no regret, no residual affection. Just a mild curiosity about whether the man she was marrying knew what he was getting into with the Harper family. Jonathan Whitmore looked like someone had ordered a groom from a catalog. Tall, square-jawed, expensive suit that fit perfectly. He worked in finance, Lucas had learned from the program someone had left on his table. Princeton graduate, member of the country club, exactly the kind of man Patricia Harper had always wanted for her daughter. Lucas wondered if Emily loved him, or just loved that he made her parents happy. Then he reminded himself it wasn't his business anymore. The ceremony ended with champagne and applause. Guests rose from their seats and migrated toward the cocktail hour in the adjacent room. Lucas stood and considered his options. He could slip out now, claim he had a babysitter emergency, disappear before the real festivities began. But something stubborn in him refused. They'd invited him. They'd sat him next to the bathroom like a punishment. Walking away now felt like admitting they'd won. He followed the crowd into the cocktail reception. The room was set up with high tables scattered throughout, servers circulating with trays of hors d'oeuvres that looked like tiny pieces of art. Lucas took a position near the back wall where he could observe without being in anyone's way. He watched Emily and Jonathan greet their guests, accepting congratulations with gracious smiles. The Harper family formed a receiving line of sorts, Patricia in a champagne-colored gown that probably cost more than Lucas's car. Emily's father, Richard, distinguished in his tuxedo. Her younger sister, Vanessa, who'd been 16 the last time Lucas saw her, and was now a woman in a burgundy bridesmaid dress. A server offered Lucas something on a cracker. He took it and ate it without tasting it. Around him, conversations flowed and overlapped. People talked about the ceremony, the venue, how beautiful Emily looked. No one talked to him. A few guests had glanced his way when he walked in, done a visible double take, then quickly looked away. Word was spreading. The ex-husband was here, in the corner, where he belonged. Lucas was reaching for another glass of champagne he didn't want when he heard his name. Not spoken to him, but about him. Two women stood near his table, their backs to him, voices just loud enough to carry. The blonde one in the green dress was saying something about how awkward it must be. The brunette responded that Emily was being very mature about the whole thing. Very gracious, letting him come, considering everything that happened. Lucas went still, considering everything that happened. He knew what the official Harper family narrative was. He'd heard it during the divorce proceedings, seen it in the way Emily's friends looked at him at the end. He'd been difficult, controlling, unable to accept that Emily needed her own space and her own life. He'd made her unhappy with his insecurity and his jealousy. The fact that none of it was true hadn't seemed to matter. The Harpers told their version, and it became reality through sheer force of repetition. The women moved away, still talking. Lucas stayed where he was and felt the first real spark of anger burn through the numbness. They'd invited him here, knowing what people believed, knowing he'd hear the whispers and see the looks and understand that this was his role tonight. The villain, graciously permitted to attend his victim's happy ending. Dinner was announced. Guests filed back into the ballroom, which had been transformed during cocktail hour. The lights were dimmer now, candles glowing on every table. The whole room softened into something romantic. Lucas returned to table 17, still empty except for him. Still next to the bathroom, where a steady stream of guests now passed close enough that he could hear their conversations. Most of them didn't acknowledge him. A few nodded, uncomfortable and quick. One older man in a navy suit actually sneered as he walked by. The salad course arrived. Lucas ate mechanically, watching the wedding party table where Emily and Jonathan sat, surrounded by bridesmaids and groomsmen. Everyone was laughing, champagne flowing, the kind of easy joy that came from being exactly where you were supposed to be, with exactly the right people. Lucas thought about Mia at home with his mother, probably already asleep by now. He thought about the morning, when she'd asked if he was nervous about seeing his old wife. He'd told her no, it was just a wedding, just a formality. He'd lied to his daughter because he'd believed Patricia Harper's civilized closure speech. The main course came and went. Lucas barely tasted it. He was too focused on the increasing awareness that people were looking at him. Not directly, but in that sideways way that meant he was being discussed. A woman at table 8 kept glancing over, then whispering to the man beside her. A group at table 5 had their heads together, one of them gesturing in his direction. The humiliation was working exactly as designed. They'd put him on display, seated him alone in the worst spot in the room, and now they were all watching to see how he'd handle it. The speeches began after dinner. The best man went first, telling stories about Jonathan that were probably funny if you knew him. The maid of honor followed with a tearful tribute to Emily's loyalty and grace. Then, Richard Harper stood up, microphone in hand, and Lucas knew with absolute certainty that this was the moment they'd been building toward all night. Richard was a lawyer, successful enough to retire at 55 and spend his time on golf courses and charity boards. He spoke the way he did everything, with absolute confidence in his own authority. He talked about Emily's childhood, her accomplishments, how proud he was of the woman she'd become. He talked about meeting Jonathan and immediately knowing he was the right man for his daughter. Then his tone shifted, became more somber. Richard Harper said he wanted to acknowledge that the path to this day hadn't always been easy, that Emily had faced challenges in her past, made mistakes as young people do, gotten involved with someone who didn't have her best interests at heart. His voice carried across the ballroom with perfect clarity. He didn't look at Lucas. He didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who he meant. Richard continued, saying that Emily had shown remarkable strength in recognizing when something wasn't working and having the courage to walk away. That she'd spent years rebuilding herself after a relationship that had been, in his words, stifling and unhealthy. That she deserved this happiness after everything she'd endured. The guests listened with rapt attention. Some nodded sympathetically. Emily sat at the head table with her eyes down. Expression unreadable. Lucas's hands tightened on the edge of the table. The wood felt solid under his palms, real and present, in a way nothing else in the room did. Richard Harper was rewriting history in real time, turning their marriage into something dark and damaging, and no one was questioning it. No one was asking for Lucas's side. They were just absorbing the story, believing it, incorporating it into their understanding of why Emily Harper deserved this perfect wedding to this perfect man. The speech ended to enthusiastic applause. Richard raised his glass in a toast to the happy couple. Everyone drank. Lucas lifted his champagne glass and set it back down without tasting it. His face felt hot. His chest was tight. Around him, the celebration continued, but he was suddenly outside of it. Watching from a great distance as the Harper family's carefully constructed narrative solidified into accepted truth. The dancing started. Emily and Jonathan took the floor for their first dance, spinning slowly, while a vocalist sang something romantic and forgettable. Other couples joined them. The music got louder, the party more raucous. Lucas sat at table 17 and felt the weight of 6 years of silence pressing down on him. He'd kept quiet during the divorce, signed the papers without making demands, never told anyone what really ended their marriage because Emily had asked him not to, and he'd still cared enough to protect her. Now he understood what a mistake that had been. Silence didn't buy you peace. It just let other people control the story. A waiter cleared his dinner plate. Lucas thanked him quietly. The waiter nodded and moved on quickly, like proximity to Lucas might be contagious. Another guest passed by on the way to the bathroom, a woman in her 50s, wearing too much perfume. She glanced at Lucas, and her lip actually curled before she looked away. The contempt was naked and casual, the kind that came from absolute certainty she was right to feel it. Lucas stood up. His legs felt strange, disconnected. He wasn't sure what he was planning to do. Leave, probably. Walk out and let them have their narrative and their perfect wedding, and their comfortable certainty that Emily had escaped a terrible situation. Go home to Mia and forget this whole night ever happened. But then Vanessa Harper appeared at his table. Emily's younger sister, 22 now, her bridesmaid dress matching the wedding colors exactly. She looked nervous and a little drunk, champagne sloshing slightly in her glass. Lucas remembered her as a teenager, following Emily around like a shadow, always trying to impress her older sister. She'd been kind to him back then, or as kind as a 16-year-old could be to her sister's husband. Vanessa said his name like a question. Lucas acknowledged her. She glanced around as if checking whether anyone was watching, then slid into the empty seat next to him. Up close, Lucas could see the family resemblance. She had the same fine features as Emily, the same way of holding herself like she was always being photographed. Vanessa took a drink of champagne and told him she was surprised he came. Her voice was careful, walking a line between politeness and something else. Lucas said he was surprised too. She laughed at that. A short sound without much humor. Then she leaned in slightly and said she wanted him to know something. That she remembered what really happened. That she'd been there when Emily came home crying that night, confessing what she'd done. Lucas went very still. Vanessa continued talking, her words slightly slurred, but her meaning clear. She said her parents had made Emily keep quiet, that they'd convinced her it was better to let the marriage end quietly, that making it public would only hurt everyone, that they'd crafted the story about Lucas being controlling because it was cleaner that way, easier to understand. She said she'd never agreed with it, but she was just the little sister. Nobody listened to her. The music pounded from the dance floor. Laughter erupted from table 3. Vanessa sat beside Lucas in the corner by the bathroom and confirmed what he'd always known, but never been able to prove. Emily had ended their marriage because she'd been having an affair with someone from her office. A partner at her father's law firm, actually. Married, 20 years older, powerful enough that Richard Harper had quietly made the whole thing disappear when it threatened to become a scandal. The man had moved to a different city. Emily had filed for divorce, and the Harper family had spent 6 years making sure everyone blamed Lucas for the failure of the marriage instead. Vanessa stood up abruptly. She said she shouldn't have told him, that her mother would kill her if she knew. She said she just thought he deserved to know that some people knew the truth. Then she walked away, unsteady in her heels, and disappeared into the crowd of dancers. Lucas sat alone again. The anger that had been building all night crystallized into something sharp and clear. They hadn't just humiliated him tonight. They'd been doing it for 6 years, systematically and deliberately, destroying his reputation to protect Emily's. And they'd brought him here, to this wedding, to complete the performance, to show him and everyone else that the Harpers controlled the narrative, controlled the truth, controlled everything. He could leave now with Vanessa's confession in his pocket. He could tell people what really happened, start fighting back against the story they'd built. But that would take months, years maybe. Lawsuits and depositions and he said-she said arguments that would drain his time and money and energy. Or he could handle it right now, in front of everyone, with the truth delivered clearly enough that no one could ignore it. Lucas stood up for the second time. His hands were steady now. His mind was clear. He looked across the ballroom at Emily and Jonathan, dancing with their wedding party, laughing and drinking and celebrating their perfect day. Then he started walking toward the center of the room, toward the band and the microphone, toward the moment that would either restore his dignity or destroy what was left of his reputation forever. The band was playing something upbeat and forgettable when Lucas reached the edge of the dance floor. Couples spun past him, faces flushed with champagne and the easy happiness of people who belonged exactly where they were. He walked through them calmly, not rushing, just a man with a destination in mind. A few dancers noticed him and moved aside. Others kept going, oblivious. The band leader saw him first, a middle-aged man in a tuxedo, holding a microphone between songs, about to announce the next dance. His eyes widened slightly as Lucas approached the small stage where the musicians were set up. Lucas gestured to the microphone. The band leader looked uncertain, glanced toward the wedding party table where Emily and Jonathan had returned to their seats. No one was paying attention yet. The band leader made a decision and handed Lucas the microphone. The music stopped. Lucas stood at the front of the ballroom, holding a microphone he hadn't planned to ask for an hour ago. The room didn't go silent immediately. People kept talking, laughing, clinking glasses. But gradually, in waves, the noise died down. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Emily looked up from her table, and Lucas saw the exact moment she recognized what was happening. Her face went pale. Jonathan said something to her, concerned. Richard Harper was already standing up. Lucas spoke into the microphone. His voice came out steady and clear, amplified across the ballroom. He said he wanted to thank the Harper family for inviting him tonight, that it had been educational, that he'd learned a lot about how they saw the past and how they wanted everyone else to see it too. His tone was calm, almost conversational, not angry, not bitter, just factual. Richard Harper was moving now, walking quickly toward the stage. Patricia had her hand over her mouth. Vanessa sat frozen in her bridesmaid chair, eyes wide. Lucas kept talking. He said he'd sat through dinner at table 17, right next to the bathroom, which seemed like an interesting choice for someone they supposedly wanted to treat with civilized respect. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Others shifted uncomfortably. Emily had both hands on the table, knuckles white. Lucas continued. He said he'd also sat through a very moving speech about how Emily had overcome a difficult past relationship, how she'd shown such strength in leaving a marriage that was unhealthy and controlling. He wanted to congratulate her on that strength. Really, it took courage to leave, especially when you were leaving to be with someone else. Someone married. Someone who worked at your father's law firm. The ballroom went completely silent. Richard Harper stopped walking 5 feet from the stage. His face was red, whether from anger or alcohol or both. Patricia made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a word cut off too quickly. Jonathan was looking at Emily now, something changing in his expression. Emily herself sat perfectly still, like a statue, like if she didn't move, the moment might somehow pass her by. Lucas said he'd kept that information private for 6 years, that Emily had asked him to, and he'd agreed because he'd thought it was the right thing to do, because he'd believed that protecting her mattered more than protecting his own reputation. He'd signed the divorce papers, moved on with his life, raised his daughter, and let the Harpers tell whatever story they needed to tell. But sitting here tonight, in this corner by the bathroom, listening to people whisper about what a terrible husband he'd been, he realized something. Silence wasn't kindness. Silence was just permission for other people to lie. Richard Harper found his voice. He demanded that Lucas put down the microphone. His tone was the one he probably used in courtrooms, authoritative and commanding. Lucas looked at him and said he'd put it down in a minute. First, he wanted to be clear about something. He didn't blame Emily for the affair. People made mistakes. Marriages failed. That was normal and human. What wasn't normal was spending 6 years systematically destroying someone's reputation to cover up the truth. What wasn't normal was inviting that person to a wedding, specifically to humiliate them in front of 200 guests. Emily finally spoke. Her voice was shaky but loud enough to carry even without a microphone. She told Lucas to stop. Just stop. This wasn't the time or place. Lucas looked at her across the ballroom, this woman he'd loved when he was too young to know better, and said she was right. It wasn't the time or place. That was exactly his point. He hadn't wanted to do this here. He'd come to celebrate, to be mature and civilized, the way her mother had said they should be. They'd made it impossible. Jonathan stood up. He asked Emily if what Lucas was saying was true. His voice was quiet, but every person in that ballroom heard it. Emily opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her father. Richard Harper said it was ancient history, a misunderstanding, gossip from a disgruntled ex-husband who couldn't let go. Lucas shook his head. He said he had phone records, text messages, emails Emily had forgotten to delete before she moved out. He'd kept them because his lawyer said he should, in case the divorce got complicated. It never had, but he still had them. Every piece of evidence that proved exactly what happened and when. That was a lie. Lucas had no such evidence. He'd deleted everything after the divorce was finalized, wanting a clean break. But the Harpers didn't know that, and the bluff landed perfectly. Richard's face changed. Patricia looked at her husband. Vanessa put her head in her hands. And Emily, finally, dropped the perfect composure she'd maintained all evening. She looked at Lucas with something like desperation and said his name like a question, like a plea. Lucas handed the microphone back to the bandleader. The man took it with trembling hands. The ballroom remained silent, 200 people holding their collective breath. Lucas said, into that silence without amplification, that he hoped Emily and Jonathan would be very happy together. He meant it. They probably deserved each other. Then he looked at Richard Harper and said he wouldn't be sharing those records with anyone. Not because the Harpers deserved his silence, but because he was tired. Tired of their games. Tired of being cast as the villain in their story. Tired of caring what any of them thought. They could tell whatever lies they wanted. He was done correcting them. He walked off the stage. Richard Harper moved aside to let him pass, something broken in his authoritative posture. Lucas walked through the ballroom the same way he'd entered it, calmly and without rushing. Guests parted around him like water. No one spoke. No one tried to stop him. Emily remained at her table. Jonathan standing beside her saying something Lucas couldn't hear and didn't need to. Their wedding was still happening. The room was still decorated. The cake was still waiting to be cut. But something essential had shattered, and everyone knew it. Lucas reached table 17 and picked up his suit jacket from the back of his chair. He thought about all the ways this night could have gone. He could have stayed home, could have thrown away the invitation, could have walked out the moment he saw where they'd seated him. Instead, he'd stayed. He'd endured the whispers and the sneers and the casual cruelty. And in the end, he'd spoken the truth, not to hurt Emily, but to save himself. The ballroom doors closed behind him with a soft sound. The marble lobby was empty, except for a few hotel staff who looked at him with open curiosity. Lucas walked through it and out into the night. The parking lot was full of expensive cars that probably cost more than his annual salary. He found his 10-year-old sedan in the back row, where he'd parked it hours ago, when he still believed this night might end in civilized closure. He sat in the driver's seat and didn't start the engine. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline catching up with him. He'd just blown up a wedding, had threatened people with evidence he didn't have, had called out a bride in front of everyone she knew. It should have felt wrong, petty, cruel. Instead, it felt like breathing after being underwater too long. His phone buzzed. His mother asking how the wedding was going. Lucas typed back that it was fine. He'd be home soon. Another lie, but a kinder one. He'd tell Mia the truth eventually. That he'd gone to the wedding, that it hadn't been what he expected, that sometimes people weren't as nice as they pretended to be. She was 9. She'd understand, or she would when she was older. Lucas started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. In his rearview mirror, the Riverside Grand Hotel glowed against the night sky. All those windows lit up and full of people who were probably still standing in shocked silence, or maybe already pretending nothing had happened. He didn't know. He wasn't there anymore. He was driving home to his daughter and his small life that had never needed Emily Harper's approval to be good enough. The highway was empty. Classic rock played on the radio. Lucas drove with the windows down, letting the night air wash over him. He thought about closure and what it really meant. Not everyone shaking hands and pretending the past was fine. Just knowing, finally, that you'd said what needed saying and walked away clean. He'd ruined their wedding the way they'd tried to ruin him, with truth delivered at exactly the right moment to do maximum damage. The difference was, his truth was actually true. By the time he pulled into his driveway, Lucas felt lighter than he had in years. He'd go inside, check on Mia, thank his mother, maybe have a beer and watch whatever game was on. Tomorrow he'd wake up and go back to his regular life, and Emily Harper would be married to Jonathan Whitmore, and none of it would matter anymore. Not because he'd forgiven them, but because he'd finally, completely let them go. Sometimes the strongest way to protect yourself isn't through revenge, but through having the courage to say enough and walk away with your dignity intact. Truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be spoken at the right moment, to the right people, in a way that can't be ignored or rewritten. And sometimes, the best closure isn't reconciliation. It's simply knowing you stood up for yourself when it mattered most, then moved forward without looking back.